Hey guys, I have a special guest today, Dave Feldman. He's a senior software engineer. Okay, so he is the master at cholesterol. And what we as far as a ketogenic diet goes, there's so many people that have questions about all different aspects. But one we're going to focus on today has to do with what happens when your cholesterol goes up, because Dave is the man to go to. I mean, I think it really takes someone from the outside of the medical profession that has enough space, enough data on logic and systems and looking at computers to really observe these interesting phenomena. So, because I think your body is very similar to a computer. It has
Absolutely.
circuits and systems and feedback loops, and so I guess let's just talk about the most important thing I want to bring up. Can we discuss what happens when you do keto, you're doing intermittent fasting, all of a sudden your cholesterol goes up and then you start freaking out? Is that a concern? And let's talk about that.
Well, of course, per your original comment, I like to joke that the human body was doing cloud computing long before we were.
Yeah.
And indeed, just like a computer, it can be a bit complex. So I try not to answer, should I be concerned or shouldn't I be, by a single marker.
Yeah.
But I will say this. I will say that to this very day, I'm finding more and more that LDL is one of the least useful markers to look at to determine your metabolic health. And that actually there's a very mechanistically sensible reason for your LDL to climb when you go on a low-carb ketogenic diet if you're being fueled by fat a lot more. And so I'm going to try not to get into the weeds too much. I sort of want to keep this, friendly for any audience member.
Totally.
But one of the most common misconceptions that does need to get relieved is that many people think when you're on a ketogenic diet that all of the fat you eat gets burned into, or gets broken down into ketones. And it's not actually true. A fraction of the fatty acids you ingest will get turned into ketones, and that's especially important for the brain. But actually, the majority of energy your tissues are using are in the form of fatty acids that you're ingesting and that are also stored in your fat cells in your body that are provided directly to your cells. And one of the means by which they're provided are in these kinds of boats that I know you've talked about in some of your videos before that we like to call lipoproteins, lipid carrying proteins. These boats are actually amazing. It's the genius of the human body that it makes it, because it carries all of the different lipids, these fats that include not just what you're using for energy, but also include cholesterol. And cholesterol, it's a common misconception. People think of cholesterol as being the same as poison almost, and that our bodies weirdly are making this poison to kill us. But the truth is, cholesterol is in every single cell in your body. In fact, the animal kingdom couldn't function without cholesterol holding the membranes of every single one of those cells together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good point just to bring up from the very beginning. We need cholesterol to make hormones. Would you agree that cholesterol, one of the functions is it's kind of like a protective type Band-Aid or a protective
Absolutely.
mechanism? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and another common misconception is that the cholesterol in your blood is deleterious, and that the lower your cholesterol, the better. And
Right.
as I'm sure you're aware, there are many, many studies that indicate that when people really bottom out on cholesterol, there's a wide range of different problems that can occur. There's lots of issues with cognition. There are a lot of problems with sex hormones. A lot of females, for example, will lose their cycle. And unfortunately, there are many other issues that can come up with, for example, infection and disease. A lot of people don't realize that these same boats we're talking about also clear pathogens in the body. And this is why people who even have the genetic disease known as familial hypercholesterolemia, which is genetically they have higher levels of lipoproteins, are known to survive pandemics, which is why it was considered an advantage before the 20th century, because you typically had a longer survival time when infection was a much bigger concern. Not that it isn't a big concern now.
Wow.
But particularly as you get older, I mean, the data is very compelling that the higher your cholesterol, the more likely your survival. And it's certainly something you want to be very mindful of before you consider taking medication.
Wow, that's awesome. Being an engineer, let's compare this, the feedback loop with what happens when you increase or decrease your dietary cholesterol. You've done some experiments, kind of touch on that.
That's right. I call it the inversion pattern. So to be sure, a lot of people go on a ketogenic diet, and kind of unintuitively, the more the more lean and or fit you are, surprisingly, the more likely it is that you'll see your LDL cholesterol go up. And that's what I found in my case. My sister and my dad had also gotten inspired to go on the ketogenic diet at the same time I did. Their cholesterol went up just slightly. Mine went up by a lot. And so that's what got me very inspired to try to look into what was going on. And sure enough, I found that my baseline cholesterol, while higher, if I then added a lot of fat, like I ate a lot more fat, it would then go down. Likewise, if I fasted, or if I just brought down the total amount of fat I was eating, it would then go back up again. And this is super important to get out to your listeners, because one of the common problems that occur with people who try to go on a low carb diet and then try to score a good cholesterol test is that they'll often bring down the amount of saturated fat they have in the days before the test. And there's enormous amounts of data that both I've demonstrated and many of my followers that'll actually spike your total and LDL cholesterol. And it typically makes your triglycerides go higher and your HDL go lower. That's the inversion pattern, and inverts. And so I demonstrated in my first public presentation of my data this inversion pattern by going the other way. I ate a ton of fat. I was, in fact, through this conference that I was holding the presentation for, I had a cooler next to me where I was just constantly grabbing meats and cheeses, and I was taking it down. And in my presentation, I said, you're actually watching my LDL cholesterol plummet. And I bet my entire reputation, all my data on it, that when I get a blood test tomorrow, it's going to show that it's dropped substantially in 3 days. And that's exactly what happened. And so a lot of people said, oh, would you do a write-up for this and kind of tell us how we can do this? And that's what I did at my site, cholesterolcode.com. It's now commonly known as the Feldman protocol. I'll bet many of your listeners have done this as well, because it's shared all over the place. It's unintuitive, but you eat a lot of fat coming up to a cholesterol test, and there's about an 85% success rate for the likelihood that you'll actually see your LDL go down.
You know, it's right in guidance physiology. They found that the people that eat more cholesterol goes down, because there's this balanced mechanism. The body will make adjustments. It just produces less. It controls the excess. So for those of you that missed that, cholesterolcode.com. In fact, I want to play this. I have a closed Facebook lab, and we do kind of some experiments here and there. I want to actually see if I can have everyone do it. We have 100,000 people. So I want to see if we can get everyone to do that, and we'll get some great data. Just to I think also you mentioned something about hyper responders, and do you want to kind of just touch on that?
I do. So a hyper responder is actually a term that predates my coming into the ketogenic diet. And what it was basically a way to refer to those people who, when they go on a ketogenic diet, see a dramatic increase in their LDL. Mm-hmm. The common refrain is your LDL may go up a little, it may go down a little, but odds are you're not one of these small subsets of people for which a lot of people worried. I myself was one of them when I found out I was a hyper responder who sees a 50, 100% increase in their LDL. So my LDL before I went on ketogenic diet was around 131, I think, was the last test I had. And it had jumped up to 270, which any doctor is going to say two things. One, they're going to say, stop doing what you're doing. And two, I have some drugs I would like you to look at to help get that number back down. And again, I'm an engineer. I will tell you, there's a very big difference in the culture between those in medicine and those in engineering. And those of us in engineering, I'm telling you, you could have the biggest bigwig engineer, senior engineer, walk into a meeting with a whole bunch of juniors, and if that engineer says something that's ridiculous, the junior engineers will challenge them. And because every engineer starts from the assumption that they're skeptical of everybody and every piece of data. They like to take it apart themselves. And that's what I did. I started taking apart the lipid system. Well, that's where I found what seems to be a big originating factor to hyperresponders. The reason for the higher amount of cholesterol that I was getting had a lot to do with my being leaner and thinner than my dad and my sister, who are very closely related. And I'll tell you, I've literally done an experiment that I'm actually still kind of in the process of. It's a pretty long one, where I've intentionally gained body fat, about 20 pounds of body fat. And I incidentally don't want anyone to follow me on this one, but I have a huge wealth of biometric data leading up to this point. So I wanted to actually capture what I believe would be the case, where my LDL cholesterol would be actually lower if my body fat were higher. And I'm happy to tell you right now that that's exactly what it was. At the very last day of my weight gain experiment, I was back down to 130 LDL, but having what would be considered a typical standard American diet, because I had to leave keto in order to gain weight. And it worked. And I was having foot-long Subway sandwiches. I was having pizza. And I wasn't even having that much sugar. It was mainly just starches. But it worked to not only give me a lot of weight, but on top of that, it dropped my LDL down to 130 milligrams per deciliter. And
Wow.
I know my prior physician, had I shown them my numbers from keto and shown them my numbers from the standard American diet, they'd probably go, "You're doing great. That's so much better."
That's fascinating. Wow.
But it gives me a segue to talk about the two metrics in that same lipid panel that matter so much more. And that is your triglycerides and your HDL cholesterol. And I'm telling you right now that I have a challenge that's out on Twitter that they haven't been able to answer yet, which is, I've been able to find studies that show if you stratify populations for having low triglycerides and high HDL cholesterol, something we see with people going on a ketogenic diet, their total cardiovascular disease risk and their all-cause mortality improve substantially. So it's only when they remove those stratifications that you get a weak correlation with LDL cholesterol. And again, this is a challenge I've been putting out for quite a long time now. And that's why, for me, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but for me, I would much rather have an LDL of 270, so long as my triglycerides are super low and my HDL is super high. I see that as an advantage.
Wow. So let's just touch on this one point about, let's say, for example, your triglycerides are low and your HDL is high, yet you have high LDL. In someone's mind, initially, they're going to go, "Oh my gosh, that's the bad cholesterol. It's going through my blood. What is it doing?" Do they need to do a special, like a test, an NMR test, to figure out what, like the type of cholesterol? You want to touch on that?
I will say this, the NMR you're talking about, it's a nuclear magnetic resonance test. And at the time that I was coming into keto, I myself was very adamant about getting that, because it does more than just capture those four metrics: total LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. It also grabs the boats themselves we were just talking about, the lipoproteins, and it breaks them out into their different types. So you hear about the small, dense versus the big, fluffy. And the small, dense is apparently more atherogenic, as they would call, which means it's more likely to be associated with the buildup of plaque in the arteries. And the big, fluffy are supposed to be generally benign. So they don't have that same risk because they're very buoyant. They don't crash into your arteries, as I've heard the refrain go. But the truth is, when it comes down to it, I've yet to see any compelling data that LDL particles that aren't modified in some fashion, that aren't oxidized or glycated, are in fact a threat at all. And I realize that this is something that kind of goes against what is considered to be conventional medical wisdom. The bottom line is the pathogenesis, the actual disease state, has never been demonstrated with atherosclerotic plaque in the absence of injury to the vessel walls or oxidative stress, or basically anything that shows a breakdown of the system itself. So this is why like having low triglycerides is such a good sign, because if you have a lot of boats but a little bit of cargo, it means the boats are succeeding at dropping that cargo off. So you don't even need to be a big senior engineer to realize this. If you're watching boats that are going out of the harbor and they're coming back empty, sounds like it's proper shipping all around.
So let's just help people to understand that when you talk about boats, you're talking about the carrier of cholesterol, LDL and HDL. So basically, when someone talks about HDL, LDL, they're talking about a protein that is carrying not just cholesterol, triglycerides,
Fat soluble vitamins
and
and antioxidants. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, these boats are carrying material for healing, repair, building tissue, cellular function, things like that, right?
Basically everything your cells need that is not already water soluble. So if it can't swim on its own in the bloodstream, again, genius of the human body, the body says, no worries, I've got one kind of boat I'm going to pack it all into. And the primary cargo, Dr. Berg, the primary cargo is fat-based energy, is triglycerides. And that's why triglycerides being low in the blood is a good sign. We're actually, on a ketogenic diet, we're actually powered by triglycerides. And that gets confusing because a lot of people say, well, wait a sec, I think triglycerides go down. Well, triglycerides left in the bloodstream go down because the usage is higher. But having low triglycerides in the blood, whether you're on a fat-based diet or not, are tightly associated with positive outcomes.
So basically, when we're talking about LDL and HDL, we're talking about, it's not just the cholesterol, it's the triglycerides they're carrying, and that
Yes.
triglyceride is used for energy and other things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's primarily energy, but it can be used for other building materials.
So, okay, so then let's just touch on another point that you mentioned, which is the reason why it's going in the first place. Well, part of this picture, it's trying to fix some damage, some oxidative damage, a lesion in the inside of the artery wall, right? Let's touch on that and maybe what could cause that.
Absolutely. And you'll have to forgive me, I am going to geek out a little bit here.
Okay.
So the best way to think of it is when you get a cholesterol test and you're capturing these LDL particles, the truth is the vast majority of them started as something known as VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins. And these VLDLs are the ones that are bloated with the triglycerides. They have tons and tons of this fat-based energy. Those things actually drop off the energy very, very quickly. And so it's in just a matter of less than an hour, a VLDL becomes what's known as an IDL, which is an intermediate density lipoprotein. And then in less than half an hour, it turns into an LDL. So when you see your bloodstream as blood markers, you actually should have a small number of those VLDLs and thus a small number of triglycerides if everything's working properly. So that LDL stage, that's not an hour or half hour. That's 2 to 4 days. Now you might wonder, why would the body want LDL particles, these boats, if they no longer have any triglycerides, the energy to deliver? Why would the body want them in the bloodstream? And the truth is, for many different reasons. They actually serve many roles. So I discussed earlier how they bind to pathogens, so they have an immunological role, just the same as your monocytes, for example. They're part of that, but they're also part of the reparative process. So imagine, for example, a whole bunch of people whose job it is to get into a delivery truck, and in 1 hour they deliver a bunch of food. But then they have kind of an all-purpose job where they're traveling the neighborhood, they're looking for bad guys to run off the road, or they're looking for a house that's damaged where, you know, they happen to have some lumber in the back that they can then pull up and try to help and fix it, right? Cells actually have receptors. They're like little arms that actually reach out to grab these when they're in need of the things that are on board, and then they can endocytose it. They actually, it's like engulfing it entirely. And then they have everything that's inside it for their own use. Cholesterol is one of the things that's part of its cargo, but the lipoprotein itself is also made of something known as phospholipids. Well, guess what our cell membranes are made of? They're made of free cholesterol and phospholipids. So cells, when they can't synthesize enough on their own, fortunately, the body wisely makes sure a lot of those lipoproteins are just ready and able to be provided for the cells to be able to get use of. And that's why it doesn't surprise me, by the way, when many people who go on statins will report having muscle pain, particularly if they tend to be a bit more athletic. Is for me, I mean, and again, I've not really put a lot of research into this, but I would not be surprised at all if it's the lack of availability for LDL particles for muscle repair and growth, which is absolutely what they get used for. So that whole stage, I mean, the whole stage of low density lipoproteins, I know it gets villainized a lot, but it's actually very powerful and necessary to the body. Where we find problems with LDL particles being associated with cardiovascular disease and risk is where we find that they may in fact be getting recruited at a higher amount. So here's where I'm going to get a little geeky, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Those cells that line our vessel wall, they're called endothelial cells. And endothelial cells, when they get damaged, they release a signaling molecule. That signaling molecule is known as a cytokine. And those cytokines at a certain amount, when there's really a problem, that actually signals the liver to upregulate more low density lipoproteins. So it's actually calling for help very specifically for low density lipoproteins because it's so important for muscle repair. When you twist your ankle and you see some of the swelling and some of the heat and so forth, there's dozens of different chemical reactions that are going on, right? But part of what they're trying to do, the swelling itself, is they're trying to pool blood. They're trying to get those raw materials to that area. And something a lot of people don't realize is there's something known as growth hormone, particularly platelet-derived growth hormone, that endothelial cells, when they're in the presence of, will express more LDL receptors. Now, I am an engineer, Dr. Berg. I'm an engineer. And when I see processes already in place that not only say, hey, this could possibly have something to do with lipoproteins, but are specifically receptors that bind to low density lipoproteins themselves, I have to say, give me a reason why this is inappropriate for the body to be making available to the cells.
Right. Wow. That is, it must, from just the level of understanding that you have, it must be almost, I don't know how you react to it, but you have this other group of people out there that are saying, no, it's the cholesterol and fat that's the main problem, which is totally the exact opposite. And I don't know how you react to it, but the one thing I want to mention is, like, there's, some people are saying that no, it's the fat, it's the cholesterol that is causing the insulin resistance. I guess it's fat within the muscle receptor for insulin. I don't know exactly the argument, but it's what's your thought on that?
Well, and you're talking to somebody who probably has more personal data points than maybe anybody you'll ever even meet. I am close to about 100 blood draws since November 2015. And it's completely ridiculous. I'm commonly referred to as a human pincushion, but I'm a bit OCD in making sure I conduct these experiments in a very controlled manner. And the vast majority of these tests, I have fasting insulin. So I'm very, very mindful of exactly what my basal insulin loads are. And from that perspective, I have to point this out. I've observed these changes and how much they correlate with weight gain, weight loss, how much they correlate with fasting glucose, and so forth. And without question, the points in which I am at the highest levels of saturated fat in my diet, the lowest levels of carbs, and at very moderate levels of protein, I have absolutely floored near bottom insulin levels, typically under 2 to 4 milli-IU. I mean, just really, really super low. But on top of that, there's a particular group of people that you may have heard me talk about that are kind of step beyond hyperresponders. I call them lean mass hyperresponders. They tend to have the highest levels of LDL, but they also tend to have the lowest levels of triglycerides and the highest levels of HDL. So they're almost like a super class. They operate on really, really, really low levels of insulin. I call them basically in a blended fasted state. And I guarantee I know several that eat 5,000 calories a day, mostly fat. And it is absolutely having nearly no impact on their insulin levels, because you need insulin primarily, particularly the postprandial insulin, to deal with glucose coming into the blood. Your body actually slowly adjusts to exactly how much insulin it needs to use to shuttle energy away. And it seeks to keep that as low as possible. It does this because the higher your insulin, the less capability your body has for something known as autophagy. And that's kind of like the housekeeping that your cells get to make use of. So this is why, by the way, I think people on the far end, I speculate, it's totally speculative, but I believe these people, these lean mass hyperresponders, may be enjoying a higher level of autophagy and might literally be actually having their cells age a little slower because of that. Being in a blended fasted state is very powerful. And that's why the ketogenic diet is so powerful, is you're in many ways mimicking a fasted state, which there are plenty of studies on long before the ketogenic diet became big as to why that's so good for longevity.
Wow. So, wow, this is fascinating. What's your thought on some of the top few triggers to things that can start this whole cascade of effect? Like, I know insulin's going to be pretty at the top of the list, right? High levels of insulin.
Yeah, you're talking the cascade of effect that can bring around a disease state, like with cardiovascular disease and so forth.
The disruption of the endothelial cells.
Yes. So here's where it's going to get a little, there's kind of almost two channels, two directions we can go. And ironically, or maybe not so ironically, they both kind of end up with higher levels of triglycerides. This is why I'm very mindful to watch for triglycerides. So the first one is you actually reach what is known as the personal fat threshold. And that tends to be somewhat individualistic. There can be some commonalities with ethnicities, but what that means is you're probably insulin sensitive up to a point where you've now parked so much triglycerides into your adipose tissue, again, your body fat, that now your body needs to find other places to park those triglycerides. So this is where you come up with things like fatty liver, fatty pancreas, even places you really don't want to see fat, like say parked in heart muscle, so forth, right? That's a huge sign, and a very common one for insulin resistance. And this is where you also tend to see a lot of this. You see a lot of things like just a larger waist circumference and so forth that you want to be mindful of. Well, this is getting back to sort of the fasted and fed state. This is where you're now moving your body into a place in which it's more predominantly in what it believes is a fed state. And how you can know this is because fasting insulin is high. If you've fasted for 12 hours and your fasting insulin is above 10, for example, then what's going on is your body still feels like there's too much energy. And that usually is the case. You find your fasting glucose is pretty high, and it's still keeping the insulin high to try to put it away. Well, now you have less autophagy. You have less of your cell's abilities to do their housekeeping, because it's like the lunch bell is constantly ringing, right? Well, this is a big problem for cardiovascular health too, because now even the endothelial cells don't get their housekeeping time. And they need that state switch because, and a lot of people don't know this, high density lipoproteins, the HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, they need a fasted phase. They need a low level of insulin to get their job done. So during the period of time where insulin is high, like when people get really sick, for example, and You've heard the term feed a cold, right?
Mhm.
There is a tiny bit of truth to that, and that as insulin goes up, it's part of not just the store and build state, but it's also oftentimes part of the fight state. It's often a way by which your body can fight disease. And my colleague Siobhan Huggins, by the way, gets into this quite a bit. This is how insulin resistance can sometimes precede hyperinsulinemia, high levels of insulin in the blood. Well, again, this is important because if you're not getting the switch back and forth between being fasted and being fed and being fasted, or for that matter, fighting a disease and then getting back to fasted, your emergency vehicles, these HDL particles, they don't have the time to also go out and grab the excess cholesterol that might have been used as part of the reparative process, and what is also known very commonly in the literature as reverse cholesterol transport. They're not able to get as much of that time as they need to get it done. Overall, you just want to have a larger amount of time in a fasted state. This isn't even by practicing fasting, but just by remaining insulin resistant, so not maxing out your personal fat threshold in the first place. Sorry, I know that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but to really kind of unpack it, it's important to kind of get that sense there. I mean, as an engineer, it makes perfect sense. You have insulin handling a lot of things at the same time. So why not go ahead and piggyback these other operations on it if throughout all of our ancestral history, we knew they were infrequent, right?
Right.
We knew when we eat, it wasn't going to be very common, or if we were eating a small amount, that it wouldn't take a lot of insulin to deal with the food that was necessary. And therefore, we could count on many other operations, piggybacking onto insulin. So in short, whether you're on a high-fat diet or a low-fat diet or whatever diet you're on, if it brings about persistently high insulin in the blood, it's almost necessarily the worst kind of state you can be in.
Wow. So let's go back, because there's one point that I want to clarify. You mentioned something about reverse
cholesterol transport. Yes.
Yeah, let's just define that so people don't get
Sure.
hung up on that.
Sure. So LDL particles, these ones that we're talking about, they're often talked about as bad because they'll put cholesterol into the arterial walls. It's really a huge oversimplification, but there is some truth to that. And part of the reparative process, can be argued, is in fact atherosclerosis. It's just progressive atherosclerosis is clearly bad. Just like insulin is not bad, you need insulin, but progressively high levels of insulin aren't bad. Inflammation, absolutely can't live without inflammation. Chronic inflammation is bad, right? So we fully anticipate the human operating system fully anticipates that cholesterol is coming into cells on a constant basis, and for many reasons, both for the reparative and also for the cells themselves. But likewise, there's this whole fleet of HDL particles, these high density lipoproteins that are on hand, that are constantly also part of the pulling it back out. And that's why they're commonly associated with having better outcomes for cardiovascular disease. The higher your HDL-C, almost universally, the better your outcome with cardiovascular disease. It's reverse cholesterol transport. They bring it out of the tissues, and then they take it back to the liver. And some of that cholesterol is reusable, and they will use it. Your body's actually greedy about holding on to and using cholesterol because it's very hard for it to make. And there's some that's not so good, and that isn't so good goes out through bile acids that we make and goes into our digestive system, and then eventually gets sent back to the other side, if you know what I mean.
So basically, it's kind of a reverse. Is it a buffer, or is it a reverse? Everything just works in reverse.
I don't know if I'd say everything works in reverse, but it's basically a means by which cholesterol is taken out of tissues and brought to the liver.
Kind of recycling?
Yeah, recycling is actually a really good way of putting it.
Okay.
And yeah, so the oxysterols, the oxidized cholesterol and so forth, that ends up getting sent out. Okay. But anything that's usable cholesterol, that's going to end up getting reused.
So as a reparative action, you have cholesterol, you also have calcium, right? Calcium tends to go in there.
Calcification. That tends to be on a more advanced level, though. That usually that's kind of to keep it layperson friendly, that's where things are bad to the point that we just want to pave over the area.
Scaffolding.
But
yeah.
Yes, that would be a good way of putting it.
So the coronary artery calcium scoring test, that's a pretty, that's a valuable test, right? To get great data?
Yes. And to be sure, there is a little bit of risk that should always be mentioned, in that there is some exposure to radiation. I think the last one I saw was like 0.6 millisievert, something like that, comparable to a mammogram. I believe a mammogram is 0.4.
So but that would be nothing compared to like a CAT scan of your abdomen or your kidneys, right?
No. In fact, a CAT scan tends to be the equivalent of around 200 chest X-rays.
Yeah. Right.
So and by the way, I just want to insert real quick.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's common practice for a hospital to just give you a CT for any particular reason. Be very mindful of that. That really is a lot of radiation exposure, and just, I would want to say, feel confident that what they're ordering is appropriate given the ailments you're talking about.
Oh yeah, because they overdo that. Yeah.
They do, and I do think it's a modern problem. But yeah. I'm glad you brought it up, because I do believe that a CAC, as metrics go, it is one of the most powerful there are, if not the most powerful for disease progression detection. Certainly you can have heart disease without having calcification, and that should definitely be said. But if you do have calcification, you do want to know about it as soon as reasonably possible. And you do want to understand its progression. So it's not, even if you get a calcium score right now, and what would be considered a not good one would be, say, like a 400, right? If you find out that you have a 400, it's not really the end of the world. What you want to be sure of is that it's not progressing at a high rate, such as like 50% per year or something along those lines. You want to be sure that it's, if it's progressing 1 or 2%. Let me put it this way. I wouldn't mind I would rather have a calcium score of 400 that was progressing at 1% per year than a calcium score of 50 that was progressing at 50% per year.
Right.
Like that's like a no-brainer for me, right? But that's important. And I will say this: one of the most heartbreaking things that we have at cholesterolcode.com is people that have just gotten their first CAC, and they're now 4 years into the ketogenic diet. They've had high LDL, but they're now questioning whether the high LDL was good, because their first CAC 4 years in says that they have, like, say, a 200. And the problem is that there's now no way to know how much of that was due to the lifestyle that they had before going ketogenic and how much was after. And that's why I generally give advice to people who are pretty sure they're going to go on keto forever, that it's nice to get the CAC as close to when you started as possible, so that you can actually have bookended, when that data started. And that way you can, first of all, certainly you would want to know if you had a CAC of like 200 or 300 or something at the point that you were starting a ketogenic diet anyway.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't evaluate something with one number. You need two numbers, before and after. You need to see progression. Is it better, worse? So I'm guessing you do intermittent fasting?
Not exactly. Okay. I would say probably my window. So when I'm in the process of doing these experiments, my intermittent fasting window may be something like 14 hours, which I kind of don't count as intermittent fasting. I sort of feel like you have to be at least 16 hours to, it's like at the ride where you have to be at least this tall. I'm not quite that tall.
But do you snack between meals?
I probably snack more than the typical ketoer. Mm-hmm. And this is actually fairly common for lean mass hyperresponders. You'll find a lot of people who are very lean and or athletic who practice keto, and actually they have a few things that are in common. Beyond being lean and or athletic and having very high levels of LDL, they have a very difficult time doing fasting, particularly very elongated fasting, like multi-day fasting. They also tend to have higher fasting glucose levels, which I believe is due to more adaptive glucose sparing. but it's important to keep the context in mind. If you have higher fasting glucose, as you've gotten leaner and healthier and feel great, don't freak out, because it's very likely that you also have lower fasting insulin, which is very suggestive that it's adaptive glucose sparing. And by the way, lean mass hyperresponders also tend to have lower levels of beta hydroxybutyrate. So relative to a typical ketoer, for example, they'll tend to have, like, say, you know, 0.4 to 1.0, and then they'll be frustrated because their couch potato keto friend, you know, is running at like 3 or 4 or something along those lines. But again, all of this suggests higher, faster utilization. The reason I give a little bit of that setup is that I probably, like many of my lean mass hyperresponder friends, and probably just having a tougher time fasting because my body is already in such a blended fasted state when I'm down at those levels that I get more signaling to do something about it. So it's okay, in fact, that there's already probably much more of the benefits of the fasted state in the first place. The downside is that, you know, if a famine hits, lean mass hyperresponders will be the first to go. Like, you know, there's a price for getting that lean.
I think you're not going to worry about the famine, so that's good. Anytime
Hopefully
soon.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Exactly. This is awesome. Do you have any last points you want to bring up? You gave us a lot of,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So I have to tell you, Dr. Berg, one of the very first and biggest things that I want to get across to your listeners is please have a fasted cholesterol test, or for that matter, any blood test. You should be 12 to 14 hours water fasted. If you are not, and I know the current guidelines, they'll say you don't really need to be fasted, but you physically are putting triglycerides from your food into your bloodstream. And that is why oftentimes we have a lot of people that come to our site that say, ever since I went keto, it looks like my triglycerides have exploded. And they'll get, you know, a score of 200 or 300. And so the first question out of the chute is, we go, was it a water only fasted blood test? And oftentimes they'll say no, they then retest later and it's fine. Like everything's, you know, below 100 or something along those lines. So that's number one. Number two is, whatever your cholesterol score is, if you see just 1% of my research, you'll find that it's insanely dynamic. I've moved my numbers up and down hundreds of milligrams per deciliter in just 3 years. I have the unique distinction of having changed my lipid numbers more than anybody else in the world. And I believe anybody else could actually do the same thing. Bear in mind, this is without any medications, supplements, exercise, anything. And it's because the human body is actually fantastically adept and very adaptable. And cholesterol is really just kind of the shadow of the larger energy metabolism. So you really need to know that the lipid system is very dynamic. And whatever your cholesterol score is, you'd be surprised at how quickly it can change, assuming that you're close to metabolic flexibility. I do want to throw in that caveat, because if you're kind of down the line, it may take a little more while to recover from where you need to be. But that brings me back to the last point I really want to get across, which is, even for somebody like myself who may be snacking more than the typical person, or eating a little bit more than the typical person, when I get down to my leaner levels, you do want to have your body generally in a fasted state most of the time. Like this, it shouldn't really even need to say this, but that's what's great about the ketogenic diet. If you get it to work properly, is you should actually be operating on very low levels of insulin overall. And I believe that if you do, it's such a huge benefit to longevity. So that's definitely what I wanted to fit in.
Awesome. That was great advice. Thanks. Thank you so much for this interview. If you guys, you need to go to his website. It's cholesterolcode.com. cholesterolcode.com. All right. Thanks so much, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Dr. Berg. I really love your material.
Oh, thanks.